A pair of shoes by the canal, and no sign of the man who wore them. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Henry. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Your comments always brighten this journey. Let's begin. Margaret had not planned to stop at the little cafe on the corner of Rue Van Gogh. It was one of those mornings when the city seemed reluctant to wake, the air hung with dampness, and a thin drizzle sifted from a colorless sky, soft enough not to demand an umbrella but persistent enough to darken the felt of his hat. He was meant to be heading to the ministry for a scheduled meeting he neither looked forward to nor believed would yield anything worthwhile. But his feet had paused, out of habit more than decision, and now he sat at the window, his large hands wrapped around a small porcelain cup. He hadn't touched the coffee yet. It was still too hot, the steam curling up to fog the lower half of the window pane. Across the street, a boy in an oilskin jacket kicked aimlessly at a puddle before hurrying off toward the metro steps. A baker opened his shutters, dragging out a chalkboard that would, before long, list prices for croissants and fruit tarts that would vanish by noon. The city stirred slowly today. Margaret reached for his pipe, tamped it with practiced ease, and lit it. He liked this cafe because no one talked to him here. He had no badge pinned to his coat, no briefcase, no sense of urgency. He was just another man sheltering from the rain, and in that anonymity there was peace. His thoughts had not been on crime this morning. In truth, they had not been on anything in particular. Madame Margaret had packed him a bit of sausage and bread for later, and he'd left her kneading dough for a brioche she intended to bake in the afternoon. He'd kissed her cheek absent-mindedly. She had asked if he would be home for dinner, and he had answered vaguely. He usually did. It was only as he stood again, adjusting his coat, that he noticed the shoes. They were across the street, just past the mouth of a narrow alley that led down toward the canal. A pair of women's shoes, high-heeled, pale beige, and placed side by side with an unsettling neatness. Not tossed or forgotten, but arranged, as if their owner had taken them off deliberately, with a kind of ceremony. Margaret didn't cross the street at once. He stood there a moment, the pipe now cold in his mouth, watching the shoes as the drizzle began to bead faintly on their surface. They were clean, too clean. Not muddy or scuffed, as they should have been if someone had walked through the damp streets in them that morning. And the way they were set, slightly angled inward, made something tighten behind his ribs. He walked over slowly, glancing once up and down the alley. The canal steps were visible from here, slick and mossy, with the constant moisture of early spring. The Seine ran quiet just beyond, a slow ripple moving under the Pont d'Austerlitz. A barge, moored to one side, rocked faintly, unattended. The shoes were the only thing out of place. No handbag, no scarf, no footprints leading away. Just the neat, solitary pair of shoes and a faint perfume that lingered. Something floral, synthetic, cheap. He crouched. The shoes were size 37, perhaps. The soles were hardly worn. There was a small, nearly invisible ink mark on the inner lining of the left one, the sort of thing a department store clerk might scribble during a seasonal sale. And faintly, beneath the leather, the imprint of toes, as if someone had stood long hours in them, uncomfortable. Behind him, someone cleared their throat. It was a street sweeper, a young man with watery eyes and a dripping mustache, watching Margaret with uncertain curiosity. "These been here long?" Margaret asked, without turning. The boy shrugged, dragging his broom back and forth with the lazy rhythm of someone paid by the hour. "Dunno, I just started my shift. Rain drives everyone off early. Maybe someone left 'em. Ran barefoot for a dare, you know." Margaret didn't answer. He stood, straightening the collar of his coat, and stared once more down the steps toward the canal. He didn't expect to see anything, and yet he couldn't stop looking. He made no report. He didn't call the local precinct. There was no sign of a struggle, no body, no crime. But as he walked away, slowly, back toward Quai d'Orfèvres, he couldn't help turning it over in his mind. Why would a woman walk to the edge of the canal in expensive shoes and leave them behind so precisely? By the time he reached his office, the soles of his feet were slightly sore, as if the answer had been hiding in each step. Inspector Janvier was waiting with the usual morning folder of incidents: a burglary in the 16th, a stabbing near Place Clichy. Routine, colorless crimes. But as Maigret hung his coat and moved toward the window to light another pipe, he found himself staring again at the gray sky above the canal, wondering who had last worn those shoes and why she no longer needed them. He said nothing. Not yet. The rain had stopped by midday, though the streets remained damp, the gutters trickling with a slow runoff that glistened under a wan patch of afternoon sun. From his office window, Maigret watched the rhythm of the city resume, the sweep of bicycles over the slick pavement, the mutter of voices, the clink of cutlery from the brasserie below. The incident with the shoes still pressed at the back of his thoughts, not like a case, not yet, but like a question without proper shape. He hadn't filed anything, hadn't even mentioned it aloud to Janvier. But there was something about the way they had been placed so still, so carefully, that made him uneasy. It was the kind of gesture one could dismiss easily if they were inclined to hurry through life. Maigret had never been in a rush. That was part of it. He walked over to his desk and took out a map of the 12th arrondissement, spreading it flat. The café had been near the Quai de la Râpée, and the alley, Rue du Chantier, sloped down toward the Canal Saint-Martin. He let his finger trace the area lazily, until it came to rest on a small cluster of buildings just south of the canal. Old workers' housing, mostly. Boarding houses. A few modest hotels that hadn't seen a coat of fresh paint in years. He lit his pipe again and considered. The shoes were new. Fashionable, if cheaply made. A woman who bought those shoes would likely care how she appeared. But someone who cared wouldn't walk barefoot across the filth of the canal steps, let alone disappear afterward. Something about it felt, not tragic, necessarily, but deliberate. He took his coat and hat and left the building without a word, bypassing Janvier's glance with a raised brow that said, "Don't ask." By the time he reached Rue Popincourt, the sun was already retreating behind the roofs. The air had cooled, and the stones underfoot steamed faintly. It was the kind of quiet hour when few people noticed a man standing on a corner for too long, and Maigret took full advantage. He stood beneath the overhang of a tata and observed. A girl passed with a baguette tucked beneath one arm. An old man leaned out of a window and spat into the gutter. A dog barked from somewhere inside a courtyard. And then, just as he turned to leave, he saw her. She stepped from the hallway of one of the older buildings, the kind with flaking blue doors and rusted balconies. She moved quickly, holding her handbag close, her heels making a precise tap-tap against the damp flagstones. But what caught Maigret's attention wasn't her haste, it was her gait. She was limping, slightly, barely enough for most people to notice, but he had watched enough bodies in motion to spot it in an instant. The right leg was just a fraction slower, the weight shifted slightly to the left. She was favoring one foot, perhaps it was new shoes. Or perhaps she had been without them altogether for a time. He followed without rushing, keeping to the other side of the street. She turned left at Rue Bassefroy, then into a small bakery with smudged glass and a faded awning. Through the window, Maigret watched her purchase a single eclair and a pack of Gauloises. She didn't speak to the clerk, didn't smile. She paid with coins and left with her eyes on the sidewalk. He waited until she was out of sight, then entered the shop himself. The baker was a man in his 50s, white apron crusted with flour. His face red from the heat of the ovens. "Good afternoon," Maigret said, removing his hat. The man gave him a curious look. "Something for you?" A question, Maigret replied, showing his identification briefly. He never held it up too long. Letting it linger only made people uncomfortable. I'm not in trouble, am I? The baker said quickly, wiping his hands on a cloth. No, just curious about the woman who was just in here. The one with the dark coat and red scarf. Madame Lisa. Comes in often. Keeps to herself. Lives just around the corner. A room above the cobbler's shop, I think. Hasn't always limped, if that's what you're wondering. How long? Week? Maybe 2. I thought she'd twisted something. Women's shoes, eh? Maigret smiled faintly. She ever mention her work? Never says much of anything. Though a week ago, I overheard her asking the tobacconist if he sold envelopes with no windows. Said she was mailing something personal. He scratched his chin. Funny thing to specify. Thank you, Maigret said, dropping a coin on the counter. He bought a brioche for later and stepped back outside. It wasn't much. A limp, a mention of blank envelopes, a woman who walked like she didn't want to be seen. But Maigret had built entire investigations on less. He found the cobbler's shop easily, its small display window, filled with faded shoe polish tins and a stack of cracked leather soles. Above it, a single window was open a few centimeters, the curtain barely stirring in the breeze. He crossed the street and entered the narrow hallway. The air inside smelled of boiled cabbage and old varnish. A brass plaque on the door read, M. Lisa Moreau. No title, no profession. He knocked gently. There was a pause, then the creak of floorboards. And finally, the door opened a sliver, held by a chain. She was younger than he expected. Late 20s, perhaps early 30s. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her eyes dark and unreadable. She looked at him without surprise. Yes, my name is Maigret. I wondered if I could ask you a few questions. Just a moment of your time. About what? The Canal. Near Quai de la Rapée, you know it? Her eyes flickered, just slightly. I pass it sometimes. Did you lose a pair of shoes? Silence. Then she closed the door, not all the way. The chain remained fastened. When she spoke again, her voice was low. Not lose. Left. And why did you leave them? He could hear her breathing. A shift of weight behind the door. Then she said, sometimes it feels better to walk away from something when you're not wearing anything at all, not even shoes. Maigret didn't press further. He stepped back. Thank you, Madame Moreau. The door closed. As he descended the stairs, he lit another pipe. The taste was damp, but it calmed him. He didn't yet know what she was walking away from, but she wasn't lying. Not in the way others lied. It was something else. Something quiet and private and deeply sad. And now at least he had a name. The following morning was still, though colder than the day before. The kind of cold that crept into stone walls and made every footfall sound sharper on the pavement. Maigret arrived at the office before most of the others. He hung his coat carefully, tamped his pipe, and lit it with a match that he let burn down to his fingertips. He stood by the window, looking out at the river, where the first barge of the morning cut a slow path upstream. Janvier entered 10 minutes later with 2 pain au chocolate wrapped in paper. He placed one on Maigret's desk without a word, then sat, waiting for a sign of conversation. Maigret took a bite, chewed slowly, and finally asked, Do we have anything at a Lisa Moreau? Lives above a cobbler's shop on Rue Popincourt. Janvier didn't blink. No known criminal record, he said after a pause. But I can dig a little, no need to press. Quietly, Maigret added, I'd like to know where she used to work. And if anyone's been looking for her. He didn't explain why. Janvier didn't ask. They had worked together long enough for such silences to pass as conversation. By noon, Maigret was walking back through the same streets as the day before. He passed the cafe from his morning. Stop, pausing long enough to watch the rain streaks on the window, now dried in trails. He continued on past the bakery, which was closed for the lunch hour. and paused outside the cobbler's. The sign in the window read back in 15 minutes, but no one had scrawled the time they had left. He pushed open the door to the building, climbed the same flight of stairs, and paused outside Lisa Moreau's door. This time he knocked once, waited, then knocked again. No answer. The hallway smelled faintly of onions and something else, mildew perhaps. Maigret removed his hat and scratched the back of his neck. He wasn't here to arrest her. She had done nothing criminal. Not that he knew of. But she had left a pair of shoes by a canal, and that fact alone had settled into his thoughts like a pebble at the bottom of a boot. He looked up and down the hallway. 4 doors. One of them stood slightly ajar. The apartment opposite Lisa's. He rapped his knuckles against the frame lightly. It was opened by a woman with gray hair tied in a bun, spectacles perched precariously on her nose, and a cardigan that hung loosely over her shoulders. "Pardon, madame. I'm Chief Inspector Maigret," he said gently. "May I trouble you for a moment?" Her expression sharpened a bit at the name, but she stepped back and gestured him in. The room was warm, cluttered with knitting needles, papers, and a cat that slept curled on a frayed cushion. She didn't ask what this was about. She poured him a small cup of black coffee and waited. "The young woman across the hall," Maigret began. "Lisa?" the old woman said, her tone a mixture of affection and vague disapproval. "She keeps to herself." "Does she have visitors?" "Sometimes men, mostly. Never the same one for long. Nothing scandalous," she added quickly, as if she'd said too much. "Just visits, and then quiet." "She live alone?" "Far as I know. Pays her rent in cash on time. Doesn't make noise. I think she works evenings, but she's been home more often lately. Or maybe just doesn't go out as much. She ever seem troubled to you?" The woman narrowed her eyes. "She's one of those people who carries something around. You can see it in the way she walks, the way she answers the door. Some sort of weight. Not anger, not shame, just tired." Maigret nodded slowly. "Merci, madame." He left her with a polite nod, then turned back to Lisa's door. Still closed, still silent, he leaned in listening. No movement inside. He made his way down to the cobbler's shop. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. "The man behind thee." Counter was bent over a half-repaired boot, wearing thick glasses and a leather apron. He straightened slowly when Maigret introduced himself. "She live upstairs, you say?" "Lisa?" the cobbler asked, rubbing his jaw. "Quiet one. Pays rent the first of every month. Never late. Doesn't complain, though I've had to send up. Plumbers twice in the last 6 months. She ever mention what she does?" "Said she used to be a secretary at some insurance place near Republic. Left a few months ago. Been freelancing," she said. "Transcriptions or typist work. Had one of those portable typewriters she took everywhere." "She get mail?" "Not that I've seen. Never leaves a forwarding address with anyone. And no name on the mailbox either. Just 3B, like she didn't want to be found." Back outside, Maigret stood in the narrow street, letting a gust of wind tug at the hem of his coat. He walked to the end of the block, took a left, and found himself on Rue de la Forge Royale, an old street, one he hadn't walked in years. It was quieter now than he remembered. The sound of his shoes on the pavement was oddly loud. He stopped at a telephone booth, inserted a coin, and called the insurance firm near Republic where the cobbler had said she once worked. After 3 transfers and a wait of 7 minutes, he spoke to a tired-sounding woman in personnel. "Lisa Moreau?" she repeated. "Yes, she worked here for a time. Filing clerk. Quiet girl, left last October, no notice. Sent a letter instead, said she had to leave Paris. Family matter. No contact since? None." He hung up. The pieces did not fit. Not yet, but they were starting to suggest an outline. He returned to the building on Rue Popincourt one last time before heading back to the Quai d'Aux Favors. He knocked again, waited. Still no answer. This time he tried the handle. It turned. The chain was off. He opened the door slowly. The room inside was small. A single bed, a desk, a low armchair by the window. Clean, but not impersonal. Yet, something was off. There were no photographs, no trinkets, no postcards pinned to the wall. Just a neat stack of typewritten pages beside the bed, and beside them, oddly, a single key resting atop a folded square of paper. He didn't touch anything. He simply stood and let the atmosphere of the room speak. There was a perfume to it, not the artificial floral from the shoes, but something more melancholy. Talcum powder, perhaps, a scent from childhood, a hint of loneliness disguised as order. He left quietly, pulling the door closed behind him. Outside, the light had begun to change. Evening was gathering itself slowly over Paris, and Maigret, with the echo of that room still settling in his bones, walked with the sense that someone had packed away their life, not out of fear, but out of finality. As if Lisa Moreau had left everything, the shoes, the room, the name behind. The next morning, Maigret woke earlier than usual. Madame Maigret was still asleep, her breathing calm, one hand resting lightly atop the coverlet. He moved with quiet care around the apartment, washing and dressing without sound, and left a note by the coffee pot that read simply, "Don't wait for lunch." He didn't know why he wrote it. Perhaps he had no appetite for food today. Or perhaps even then, he sensed that the hours ahead would lead him not toward a solution, but deeper into the quiet fog of a mystery that refused to name itself. Back at the Quai d'Orfèvres, the morning routine carried on with its usual dull rhythm. The brass handles of the file drawers clinked softly as Janvier sorted through a stack of case notes. Inspector Torrance, looking bleary-eyed and underslept, cradled a coffee while leafing through a report he barely seemed to read. Maigret sat with his pipe unlit, fingers pressed together under his chin. He was not thinking, not exactly. He was listening inwardly, the way one might listen for the ticking of a stopped watch. Something about Lisa Moreau's room still disturbed him, the tidiness, the absence of photographs, and that single key resting on the folded paper. A gesture meant to be noticed, left behind deliberately. By 10 o'clock, Janvier entered with a slip of paper in hand. "Bit of something," he said, placing it on Maigret's desk. "Moreau, Lisa. No police record, no psychiatric file, no civil complaint. But I did get a call back from a clerk at the insurance office. He said there was one strange thing when she quit." Maigret glanced up. "They held her final pay for pickup," Janvier went on. "She never came for it, just left it." "Did the clerk say how much?" 462 francs. Nearly a full month's wage. Maigret gave a low grunt. Not the kind of money one forgets unless they intend not to need it anymore. He took his coat, this time offering no explanation at all. The rhythm of his steps was unhurried, but something in the way he walked made Janvier pause. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Dust and grit from the streets swirled into the corners where pigeons huddled near metro vents. Paris, in its mid-morning bustle, paid little attention to the man in the thick coat and dark hat, who moved from Rue de la Roquette down toward the Canal again. He returned to the spot near the steps. The shoes were gone, of course. Someone, a cleaner, or perhaps even Maigret himself in some idle moment the day before, had removed them. The stone at the base of the alley still bore 2 faint marks where they had stood. Dampness had settled into the stone in the shape of their solace. A canal worker, broad-shouldered, with rolled sleeves and a pipe half-smoked, leaned against the rail nearby, watching the barges move with the resignation of someone who had seen the same view for decades. "You work this stretch often?" Maigret asked without introducing himself. There was no need. The man nodded. 22 years. Pulling ropes, watching moorings, keeping an eye on drunks. Maigret pointed toward the steps. You see anyone here early yesterday, morning before 9? The man scratched his jaw, exhaled smoke. Might have. Young woman, no coat, came from the alley, walked down to the water. Thought she might jump, but she just stood there. Did she say anything? Didn't look like she wanted to talk. Had a scarf pulled tight, hair all wet. Then she just left. Up the other steps. No shoes. Maigret's eyes narrowed. You sure about that? Yeah, she walked barefoot. I remember thinking it'd be hell on her feet. Time? 7:30 maybe. Not long after the garbage lorry passed. Maigret nodded slowly, gave a soft thank you, and moved on. Back at the quay, he made a call to a contact at the Poste de la Bastille and requested any street incident reports for the previous morning. Nothing had been filed. No missing persons, no accidents near the Canal. He didn't expect anything. At noon, he found himself once again on Rue Popincourt. He had no warrant, no directive, but he had his coat, his hat, and the kind of presence that made few people ask questions. The door to Lisa's apartment was still unlocked. Or perhaps it had been locked again, then left open. Either way, it swung inward at the lightest push. Inside, little had changed. The bed remained undisturbed. The desk was still orderly. But a detail stopped Maigret short. The small table beside the typewriter now held a man's wristwatch. He walked to it slowly. It was a modest piece. Brown leather strap, silver casing, cracked crystal over the dial. The time was wrong. Nearly 6 hours off. Or perhaps it had stopped entirely. Maigret sat down in the low armchair and studied the room. Still no photographs. No lipstick on the rim of the teacup left near the sink. But the presence of the watch, that changed the tone. He left the building and stopped once more in the bakery. The woman behind the counter gave him a blank look until he described the wristwatch. Couldn't say, she murmured. Plenty of people wear watches like that. Not like this. This one's old. Leather cracked, clasp missing. A tooth. She blinked, then nodded reluctantly. Now that you mention it. There was a man with her a few nights ago. Not the usual type. Thinner, more nervous. Wore gloves even though it was warm. Looked around a lot. They didn't talk much. He paid for her eclair. Hands shook a little. What night? Monday. Maybe. No, Sunday evening. And you haven't seen him since? No. Outside again, Maigret felt the wind shift. It tugged at the edges of his coat, lifted the brim of his hat. He stared at the rooftops opposite. That detail, the gloves, had the feel of something important. Nervous people often cover their hands when they feel guilty. He walked for several blocks, not toward the quay but aimlessly, as if allowing the rhythm of the city to brush against his thoughts. At Place Voltaire, he turned into a tata and ordered a coffee. The man behind the counter had ink stains on his thumb and smelled faintly of newsprint. While he poured, Maigret asked if he ever saw a girl named Lisa Moreau. The name struck recognition. She comes in once in a while, the man said. Mostly to buy envelopes. The kind without windows. Always careful about her change. She come in alone? Usually, but last week she was with a man, didn't speak. He had a briefcase. Looked lost. Do you remember anything about him? Mid-30s, pale. The kind of face you don't remember until someone asks you to. Something nervous in the way he stood, that's all. Maigret drank his coffee slowly, then paid and left. The watch, the man with the gloves, the envelopes, none of it added up yet. But it didn't have to. Not yet, he knew the shape of this kind of mystery. It wasn't about sudden violence or missing jewels. It was about someone who had tried to vanish quietly, and someone else who had either helped or tried to stop it. He thought again of the key left behind on the folded paper. The next step, he realized, would be to find out where that key fit, and who, if anyone, had come back for it. By late afternoon, the sky over Paris had begun to gray again. The light dimming as though someone were slowly lowering a curtain over the city. Maigret returned to his office at the Quai des Orfèvres with the key in his coat pocket. He hadn't told anyone he'd taken it. It had been left out in the open, on the folded square of paper, as though meant for him to find. It was small and brass, of a type commonly used for luggage or private lockers, not a house key, not one that matched the lock to Lisa Moreau's apartment. That alone intrigued him. A second place. A hidden place. He sat at his desk without taking off his coat and rolled the key between his fingers. It had no tag, no number, no engraving. Just the worn curve of the handle and a fine groove down the shank. It smelled faintly of old metal and something else, dust perhaps. The folded paper beneath it had been blank. Janvier entered, carrying a sheaf of typed notes. "Nothing on Lisa Moreau's family," he said. "No local relatives. No marriage. Records. She's practically a ghost." "She's not a ghost," Maigret murmured. "She left too many traces for that." Janvier hesitated. "There's one thing." A name came up. "Not officially. I was speaking to one of the clerks at the courthouse. He said a man had once come asking if the police had ever made inquiries about a woman named Lisa. No complaint. Just a question. This was a year ago. Name of the man? Paul Besson. Worked briefly for the Ministry of Culture. Desk clerk. Left suddenly. No known address. Might have been her lover, or something else." Maigret filed the name away silently. A man with a reason to ask about a woman who had not been reported missing. He thought of the man with the gloves, the briefcase, the trembling hand. "You ever notice how the people who are supposed to disappear never do it cleanly?" Maigret said. "It's always the ones who don't plan to vanish who end up gone without a trace." Janvier looked puzzled, but Maigret waved him off and reached for his overcoat again. "I need an hour. Maybe more." This time, he walked across the Seine toward Gare de Lyon, into the older districts near Rue de Charenton. He was no longer certain what he was searching for. But something told him the key did not belong to anything elegant. It was too scratched. Too used. A locker? A backroom? A rented cupboard? He entered a post office first. Quiet. The smell of ink and glue. A clerk looked up from behind the glass. "I'm looking for a lock that might match this," Maigret said, sliding the key through the opening. The clerk frowned, turning it over in her fingers. "Not one of ours," she said. "Could be train station. Or a commercial depot." The next stop was Gare de Lyon. He bypassed the noise of the main platforms and walked toward the long row of luggage lockers tucked away near the far end of the station. Most were newer, with combination dials, but a few older ones still remained. In the corner, the sort used by travelers who still carried actual keys. Maigret tried the key in the first four. Nothing. He moved slowly, checking numbers, breathing through his pipe as he worked, the tobacco now more for rhythm than pleasure. He reached locker 113 and paused. The key turned. It didn't click open. Not at first. He had to press his hand against the door, feel the small give of metal. Then it swung open quietly. Inside was a handbag. Black leather, neatly folded scarf on top. Beneath that, a bundle of typed papers wrapped with a rubber band. He pulled them out carefully. Names, addresses, transaction records, some typed. Some handwritten annotations in the margins. At the bottom of the stack, a small blue book, a passport, Belgian. Lisa Moreau's name printed inside, along with an older photograph that showed her face with longer hair, no makeup, and eyes that already held the same weariness. There was also a white envelope, unsealed. Inside it, a single page typed. "To whom it may concern," it began. Maigret read slowly, standing there in the dim hallway of the station, the scent of metal and paper hanging in the air. The note was not a suicide letter, nor was it a confession. It was rather a sort of farewell, not dramatic, not poetic. Just a quiet statement. I have removed myself from a life I no longer recognize. I am not missing. I am choosing to be absent. Let no one search for me. Let no one claim me. If I am remembered, let it be for silence. He folded the letter and replaced it in the envelope, then returned the documents to the bag. He closed the locker but kept the key. There was no rush. He would return to it later. For now he needed time. He walked out into the gray light of the station plaza. The wind tugged at his coat, and he turned up the collar. It was beginning to come clear now, but not in the way that led to an arrest. No crime had yet been committed. A woman had simply stepped out of her life, carefully, methodically, and without violence. The only unknown was whether someone else, someone with gloves, with a trembling hand and a forgotten watch, had tried to stop her, or to follow her. He walked the length of the street to a small cafe near the viaduct. Inside he ordered a beer and sat at a corner table. He let the condensation run down the glass without wiping it. His thoughts returned to the note. There had been no mention of Paul Besson. No date. No specific event that had driven her to leave. Just a tone, restrained, final, quiet. Not desperation, not even sadness. Just distance. He watched the faces of passers-by outside, the blur of umbrellas, a man in a suit checking his wristwatch, a girl chasing a paper bag blown by the wind. All of them moving through the city as though each was headed toward something clear, definable, and yet he knew better. So many lives in Paris drifted like this, slowly, gently, slipping out of view, not with cries, but with sighs. He lit his pipe, leaned back, and closed his eyes for a moment. There was still no body, still no crime. But Maigret felt the pull of something, not obligation, not even duty. Just a quiet responsibility to see it through. To understand, if not to interfere, he would find Paul Besson. Not because Lisa had asked for it, but because her silence had. The next morning came with no change in weather-low gray skies, streets brushed with the memory of night rain, and the kind of cold that nestled between the layers of your coat and didn't leave until noon. Maigret stood before the mirror. In his modest apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, knotting his scarf a little tighter than usual. Madame Maigret, dressed in her thick wool cardigan, was quietly slicing apples for a tart, the sharp click of her knife a metronome to the morning. "You're not eating," she said softly. "I'll eat later." "You always say that." He didn't answer, only reached for his hat. But just as he stepped toward the door, she added without looking up, "I read once that when people disappear, it's not always to escape others, but sometimes to escape the person they've become." Maigret paused. He gave her a nod, not quite agreement, but not disagreement either, and left. It was the kind of remark that would stay with him for the rest of the day, whether he wanted it to or not. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he began the Fondue morning with a quiet request to Janvier, Paul Besson, former clerk at the Ministry of Culture. Left the post last year. I need every thread. Janvier made no comment, only nodded and began the slow and bureaucratic work of hunting ghosts. By mid-morning, Maigret was walking down Rue Jacob, past the old printing houses and cafes where forgotten poets once argued about commas. The Ministry of Culture wasn't far, an old building that still smelled faintly of wood polish and coal dust. Inside, a woman in a brown jacket and horn-rimmed glasses checked the registry for him. "Paul Besson," she murmured, squinting. "Yes, Archives Department. Left in October. Quiet man, never spoke much. Said he was going south, I think. Did he file any address change? Or leave a forwarding contact?" "None. Just a resignation letter." It was handwritten. Odd these days. She allowed him to read it. The handwriting was neat but faint, like the voice of someone unsure if they ought to be heard. "I thank you for the opportunity," it read. "I have decided to pursue a quieter life. My time here has been instructive, but I am no longer suited to such duties. There was no signature flourish, no telephone number. Just the name, Paul Besson. Did anyone here know him well? Not really, he came and went. Didn't socialize. Though there was one odd thing, someone from the police came by a few weeks later asking about him. From another department, I think. Margaret looked up. You remember who? She shook her head. A man in a trench coat. Quiet. Didn't show credentials. Just asked if we knew where Besson had gone. We told him no, and that was that. Margaret thanked her and left. Outside, he lit his pipe and stared up at the rooftops. A stranger asking about a man who had disappeared. Perhaps that man in the trench coat wasn't police at all. Perhaps he was chasing something. Or someone. At lunch, Margaret didn't return to the Quai d'Orfèvres. Instead, he sat in the corner of a café near Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, where the waiters wore old waistcoats and no one hurried you out. He had a glass of red wine, a plate of cold beef, and a hard-boiled egg with salt. He ate slowly, watching the world move around him. The conversation at the table beside him was about theater. Behind him, a woman was scolding her child in a low hiss. Life continued, as it always did, ignorant of the quiet holes left by people like Lisa Moreau and Paul Besson. He was just finishing his coffee when Janvier appeared, coat unbuttoned, shoes damp from hurried walking. I think I found him, he said without sitting. Or something close. Margaret gestured for him to continue. There's a small lodging house in Ivry, near the old gasworks. Registered to a P. Besson, paid for 1 month in advance. 2 weeks ago, no employer listed. The landlady says he's barely left his room. Margaret placed his napkin on the table and stood. They took the metro to Ivry. The trains were half empty. The city thinned as they moved outward, less noise, fewer windows with lit signs. They emerged into streets bordered by shuttered shops and faded advertisements. The lodging house was narrow, wedged between a butcher's shop and a closed garage. The landlady was a stout woman in slippers, with a cardigan that looked more like upholstery than clothing. Yes, she said, glancing from Janvier to Margaret. He's up on the 2nd floor, room at the end of the hall, paid in cash. Doesn't make trouble. Doesn't say a word. May we speak to him? She hesitated. You're not going. To frighten him, are you? Looks like he's already been frightened enough by the world. Margaret shook his head. We'll be quiet. The hallway smelled of wax polish and something musty. They climbed the stairs slowly, footsteps muffled. Margaret knocked on the door, once, then twice. A long pause. Then the door opened just wide enough to show a pale face, unshaven, with the drawn, sunken cheeks of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. Yes? Paul Besson? Yes. My name is Margaret. I'd like a word. May we come in? Besson hesitated, then opened the door. The room was bare, a single bed, a folding chair, a small case of books, no photographs, no personal touches. Only a typewriter on a side table, and beside it, a half-full ashtray and an untouched apple. Margaret remained standing. Do you know a woman named Lisa Moreau? Besson blinked, his expression tightening. Why? She left a note. Not addressed to anyone, but your name came up. She left? Yes. He sat down on the edge of the bed. His hands rested in his lap, fingers curling inward. I didn't expect her to. I thought I would have to help. Her, or maybe stop her. What do you mean? She said she couldn't live in silence anymore. But she also said she couldn't return to noise. That's how she put it. I didn't understand then. I think I do now. Margaret nodded. Did you give her the key? No, she gave it to me once. I gave it back. I thought she meant to store something, a gift for someone, but I think now it was just the last part of her she wanted to leave behind. Have you tried to find her? No. Margaret watched him carefully. Why not? Besson's eyes were calm now. Because she said not to. And because, if I'm honest, I think she already did what I never could. Which is? Disappear with intention. The silence between them settled like dust. No one moved. At last Maigret said, "If we need to reach you again?" "I'll be here," Besson said softly, "until I'm not." Back on the metro, Janvier looked at Maigret with a question on his face. "Well," he asked, "do we consider it closed?" Maigret looked out the window as the city began to return, street by street, station by station. "No," he said, "not closed. Not open. Just suspended." Then he turned back to the glass and said nothing for the rest of the ride. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of Maigret's office, casting a dull reflection on the polished wood of his desk. He sat with his elbows resting heavily on its surface, eyes closed, pipe unlit between his fingers. Around him, the usual murmurs of the Quai d'Orfèvres continued. Footsteps, a drawer sliding open, a telephone ringing 3 offices down, distant laughter that faded quickly. But Maigret heard none of it. He was thinking not of Paul Besson's face pale and uncertain in the rented room in Ivry, nor even of Lisa Moreau's carefully typed farewell tucked away in a locker at Gare de Lyon. He was thinking of the smell in her room, talcum and ink, and of the blankness, not emptiness, but deliberate removal. A woman who had erased herself with precision, like someone scraping their name off an old envelope. He had seen disappearances before. People fled debts, lovers, shame, or sometimes simply life itself. But there was something different about this case. Something quiet but unrelenting, like a sound just at the edge of hearing. He reached for the folder Janvier had left on the corner of the desk earlier. A list of old correspondence, stamps of entry and exit at border controls. An incomplete trace of Lisa's life, from her childhood in Liege to her clerkship in Paris. There were odd gaps, a 2-year period with no job record, an address registered to a boarding house that had burned down 5 years ago, a permit for work that had been issued, then inexplicably revoked without explanation. Bureaucratic noise on the surface. But Maigret knew that the real story often lay in the silences. Between records, he closed the folder and rose. "I'm going out again," he told Janvier, who nodded without asking. Outside, the rain had returned, thin, cold drops that stitched the sky to the rooftops. Maigret buttoned his coat fully and walked, this time without a clear destination. His feet led him through the 11th arrondissement, back toward the neighborhoods that still held the echo of Lisa Moreau, the bakery, the quiet hallway, the cobbler's shop, now shuttered for repairs. He passed by her building but did not stop. There would be nothing new there, not today. Instead, he turned down Rue Saint-Maur and found himself in front of a small stationery shop tucked beneath an overhang, its window fogged from the inside. He stepped in, the bell above the door jingling faintly. The interior was narrow, lined with shelves of envelopes, ink bottles, fountain pens, ledgers. The woman behind the counter was arranging boxes of carbon paper with quiet efficiency. She looked up, startled but polite. "May I help you?" Maigret removed his hat. "I'm looking for someone who might have been a customer here." A woman in her early 30s, dark hair, neatly dressed. Preferred typewritten correspondence. She might have purchased blank envelopes, the kind without address windows. The woman tilted her head slightly. "I don't remember names." "Well, but descriptions perhaps. Sit down, won't you?" He lowered himself into the wooden chair beside the counter as she poured him a small glass of lukewarm tea from a thermos beneath the register. "There was someone like that," she said after a moment. "She came in once every month or so. Always bought the same thing, a packet of white A5 sheets, 24 blank envelopes, and a roll of carbon paper. Never spoke much, polite. Precise. Do you remember the last time she came in?" The woman frowned. "A month ago, perhaps. No, longer. 5 weeks. She looked thinner than usual, tired. She didn't linger. Maigret sipped the tea. She ever post anything? From here? The woman hesitated. Twice, I think. She'd bring the letter sealed, asked for postage to Belgium, said it was for family. Do you remember the name on the envelope? The woman stood and disappeared into a small room at the back. When she returned, she carried a thick book bound in red cloth, a log for registered mail. She flipped through the pages slowly. There, she tapped it. 2 registered letters, both sent to the same address. Rue de la Baume, Liege. Maigret copied it down. He thanked her, left the shop, and stood for a moment beneath the awning. The rain had worsened. Cars hissed past, trailing water. A cyclist struggled uphill with a bag of groceries hanging dangerously from the handlebar. He walked to the nearest cafe and found a table beneath the overhang, where the rain could be heard but not felt. He lit his pipe with effort, the matchstick bending damp in his fingers, and drew in the smoke slowly, thoughtfully. Liege, the city of her birth. A place she hadn't returned to in years, if the records were accurate. And yet she had written there, twice, both times recently. Which meant, perhaps, she had not severed all ties. Not yet. He jotted the address down on a postcard and handed it to a waiter with the request to telephone it in to headquarters, a formal inquiry, by diplomatic means, for confirmation of the resident at Rue de la Baume. He didn't expect an answer. Today, bureaucracy moved slowly, slower than grief, slower than memory, and certainly slower than the act of disappearance. But something in him shifted, subtly. If Lisa Moreau had written to someone in Liege, then her decision to disappear had not been entirely solitary. It had been witnessed, perhaps even supported. He stared into the drifting smoke of his pipe, and thought again of the man with the gloves, the trembling hand, the abandoned watch. What had bound them really? Not love, surely. Or not only that. Perhaps something more quiet, an agreement. A shared knowledge, or guilt. As he finished the last sip of his lukewarm wine, a thought struck him, not with violence but with slow certainty. What if the man had not come to stop her, as Maigret had assumed? What if he had come to say goodbye? He stood up again, leaving coins on the table, and walked toward the metro. Evening had begun its slow descent over the city, turning the buildings a darker shade of gray. Street lamps flickered on, their glow caught in the sheen of wet cobblestones. As he descended into the warmth of the station, Maigret thought not of crimes, or leads, or evidence. He thought of people folding their lives into envelopes, trusting the post to carry what they could no longer speak. And he thought, with a faint ache behind his ribs, that sometimes the most haunting absences were not caused by violence, but by the quiet decision to be no longer known. The evening passed without conclusion. Back at the Quai d'Orfèvres, Maigret sat at his desk long after most of the others had gone home. The hallway outside had grown quiet, only the occasional shuffle of a constable's boots or the creak of an old radiator breaking the silence. He let his pipe burn low, cleaning it out methodically and refilling it without thought, letting his mind wander back through everything he knew and everything he did not. The address in Liege sat at the top of his notepad, underlined once. Janvier had called in the request through the appropriate diplomatic channels. A reply would come eventually. But for now, it was just a line on a page, a street in another country, a place that might explain who Lisa Moreau had once been or who she had turned away from. It was not Maigret's custom to push when the path grew dim. He preferred to wait, to let people reveal themselves, as they always did, in their own time. But this mystery was not behaving as mysteries usually did. It did not want to be solved. It wanted to dissolve. He rose just after 10, returned his coat to his shoulders, and walked home through streets that glistened beneath the quiet drizzle. His hat caught the mist, softening the lines of his silhouette. Paris at that hour was a different city, Slower, without appetite, its pulse deep beneath the stone. At home, Madame Maigret had left the light on in the sitting room. A casserole dish rested on the stove, covered in foil. "She telephoned," she said as he entered. Maigret blinked. "Who?" "The woman, from Rue Popincourt." He stood, very still. "Lisa Moreau?" She nodded. "She didn't say her name, but she said she knew you'd understand. That you were the only one who would." "What time was this?" "Just past 9. She asked me to tell you she hadn't gone far." Madame Maigret watched him closely, her eyes filled with quiet concern. She didn't sound frightened, just tired. Maigret sat down slowly in the armchair by the window. He didn't remove his coat. He stared at the space between two framed photographs on the opposite wall, one of their honeymoon in Normandy, the other of an old family gathering where no one had smiled quite naturally. "She knew I'd understand," he repeated softly. Neither of them spoke for a time. Outside, the mist deepened, curling around the lamplight like smoke. "She didn't ask you to come," Madame Maigret added gently. "She only asked you to listen." The next morning, Maigret returned early to the Quai d'Orfèvres. A note was waiting for him on his desk. An envelope marked with no sender slid under the door by the night shift. Inside was a single sheet of typewritten paper. "I have not left Paris," it read, "but I am preparing to. Please do not try to find me. I am not in danger. I am not lost. There are some absences that are not tragedies, only choices." There was no signature. Only a small ink blot at the bottom right corner of the page, faint, as though the ribbon had been near its end. Maigret sat with it in his hand for several minutes. He compared the paper to the letter from the locker, same typing style, same rhythm of words. This was Lisa Moreau, beyond any doubt. He placed it gently on the desk and reached for his file. There, on the second page, was the last known record of her employment, a typed letter of resignation, terse and formal. But at the bottom of that letter, unlike the one from the locker or this most recent note, there had been a signature. He studied it now. L. Moreau, slanted left, compact, with a long trailing tail on the man that dipped below the line. He took out a magnifying lens from the drawer. The ink from the old signature had bled slightly into the page. Fountain pen. Personal. He returned to the note from that morning. There, in the bottom right, something faint. Almost nothing. But not nothing. A pressure mark, barely visible in the grain of the paper. Someone had signed, then removed the name. He turned it gently under the desk lamp. At a certain angle, the ghost of the signature revealed itself, the tail of an M, faint as breath on a mirror. She had signed it, then erased it. He let the pages rest on the blotter and leaned back, exhaling slowly through his pipe. What kind of person signs a letter, then removes their name? Not to hide, but to withdraw, to step out of it. Janvier entered quietly. "A response from Liege," he said, holding a sheet. Maigret read it with care. The address belonged to an elderly woman named Jean Moreau, widowed. No record of criminal history. No official inquiries. But she had received 2 letters in the past 2 months from a French postmark. One returned unopened. No daughter registered under that address. No mention of Lisa. She must be her mother, Janvier said. Or some aunt. The name matches. Maigret nodded but said nothing. He closed the file and tapped the tip of his pipe against the ashtray. Then he stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city stirred again under low clouds. Bicycles wove between delivery vans. Someone called for a dog in a side street. He didn't feel closer to an answer, only deeper into her silence. But the silence had texture now. He could feel it, not avoidance, not fear, intention. He turned. T.O. Janvier. I want to know where she learned to type like that. Those strokes, she's practiced. It's not secretarial. You think she was a writer? I think she was trying to be forgotten by someone who once knew how she thought. It was a strange thing to say, and Janvier looked puzzled, but Maigret didn't explain. He returned to his chair and began writing a note of his own. Not official. Not for the record. Just a few lines to be left with the folder in the drawer, where it would sit unfiled for now. She was not hiding. She was making space, and under that, to be followed up only if found. Otherwise, to be left alone. He folded the paper, slipped it inside the file, and closed the drawer. For now, that was enough. The air was warmer that morning, as though spring were testing its footing after a long hesitation. Along Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the trees shimmered faintly with buds not yet brave enough to bloom. Maigret, already awake before the sun had fully risen, stood by the window of his apartment holding a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. He wasn't thinking in sentences, just fragments, a name, a street, a voice that had said, "I haven't gone far." He turned toward Madame Maigret, who was folding linen at the table. "She called again," he said. "No," she replied, shaking her head gently. "But I thought she might. So did I." He left without finishing his coffee. At the Quai d'Orfèvres, a new stack of petty theft reports waited on his desk. Torrance had already begun leafing through them half-heartedly in the next room, muttering about pickpockets near the Porte Saint-Martin. Maigret pushed the papers aside. He didn't mention the second note from Lisa. He hadn't filed the first. There was no case officially. Just the echo of someone stepping carefully out of their own life, not to escape, not to vanish, but to shed something she no longer wished to carry. Still, there was something left, a part unfinished. Not evidence, not motive, but presence, and it hadn't faded yet. He called Janvier in. "Find out if there are any temporary rentals or furnished flats taken in the last 10 days under cash terms," he said. "Anywhere within 3 kilometers of Rue Popincourt. Look for names that don't match the IDs given. Use the neighborhood records, not the central files." Janvier raised an eyebrow. "You think she's still here?" "She told me so." He said it flatly without explanation. By mid-afternoon, Janvier returned with a small slip of paper. "You may have something," he said. "A landlord. Near Rue de la Fontaine aux Joureaux, I let a top-floor room 3 days ago to a young woman. Paid in advance, no ID, said she was in between flats." Maigret took the address and left without putting on his hat. The walk was short, through streets still wet from the morning's rain, the kind of slow drip from window ledges that left dark spots on the stone below. The building was narrow and crooked, a leftover from an older Paris. 4 floors. The uppermost reached by a stairwell that grew increasingly warped as it climbed. The banisters were worn smooth from generations of hands. The landlady met him halfway up. "She's quiet," she said. "No radio, no visitors. She paid for the week and asked for nothing else. You speak to her?" "Only to say good evening. She seemed tired, but not sick." Maigret nodded. "Let me up alone." At the top, the door to the flat was closed. He knocked once, a pause, then footsteps, careful ones. The door opened a fraction. Lisa Moreau's face appeared in the gap. Her eyes were tired, but not frightened. "I thought it might be you," she said. "I don't have a reason to disturb you." She opened the door farther and gestured for him to enter. The room was small, barely more than a garret, but warm. There was a single table with a lamp, a bed with a folded blanket, and 2 cups on the windowsill, one half full with weak tea. The curtains were drawn, though it was daylight outside. She motioned toward a chair, and Maigret sat. They were quiet for a long time. Finally she said, "I didn't mean to make a mystery." "I don't think you did," Maigret said gently. "But one formed around you all the same." She looked at her hands. "I just wanted to stop being watched. Even by no one in particular. I wanted the choice not to answer questions." Not to belong to anyone's story. Even your own? A pause. Especially my own. Maigret didn't press her. He looked around. A stack of papers on the table. A packet of envelopes. A portable typewriter. A plate with crumbs. She followed his gaze. "I've been writing," she said. "Not for anyone. Not to explain, just because the words have to go somewhere." He nodded. "I found the locker," he said. She didn't seem surprised. "I read the note." Her gaze dropped. "Then you understand. I think so. You're not going to report me?" "There's nothing to report." She met his eyes again. "They always think there's a man. That it's about love. And is it?" She smiled faintly. "There was a man. Several, but no. That's not why I left." "Then why?" She drew the curtain back slightly. Outside, the rooftops glistened with lingering rain, and pigeons gathered around a chimney for warmth. "Because I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone who smiled when spoken to, worked when told, dressed in shoes she hated, and kept quiet even in her own head. One morning I realized I'd been living the life of someone who had never actually arrived, just a placeholder. You could have gone to the country. I didn't want to go somewhere new. I wanted to be nowhere at all." The air in the room felt very still. The kind of stillness not born of fear, but of a decision long since made. "I won't follow you again," Maigret said. "I know." He stood. As he reached the door, she said softly, "You know I didn't do anything wrong." He looked at her. "No," he said, "but it's not only wrong things that vanish." Then he was gone, his steps quiet on the warped wood, descending into the hush of the stairwell like a man stepping back from the edge of someone else's solitude. Outside, the air had cleared slightly. He did not return to the office. He walked instead toward the canal, where the water caught fragments of the sky and carried them off in slow ripples. At the place near the steps, where the shoes had once stood, there was nothing now. No trace. Not even a damp mark left behind. Maigret stood a long time, watching the current, not searching, not waiting, just remembering. The next few days passed with a kind of quiet that only Maigret seemed to notice. Paris, as always, pulsed on. Markets opening early in the mist, cafes humming with the clink of cutlery and voices that rose and fell with each hour, pigeons shifting from one rooftop to another like the breath of the city itself. But in Maigret's world, the rhythm had changed. He didn't mention Lisa Moreau again, not to Janvier, not to Torrance, not even to Madame Maigret, who understood better than anyone when a silence was meant to be left intact. Her final image, standing by the window of the little garret on Rue de la Fontaine aux Arouets, curtain in hand, pale but steady, stayed with him like the smell of a faint perfume on a scarf days after it's been folded and put away. No arrest had been made, no file had been opened, there was no crime. No one had gone missing, and yet something had happened. Something he had been part of without fully touching it. On Thursday, the envelope arrived. It was addressed to him directly. His name handwritten in a neat, familiar hand. No return address. No postage mark. It had been delivered in person to the front desk, the clerk said, by a young man in a dark coat who didn't wait, who left as quietly as he arrived. Maigret opened it slowly, seated alone at his desk in the early hour before the key filled. With noise and boots and paper, inside, a single sheet typed. "I'm going now, not out of fear or sadness. Simply because I have finished what I needed to finish. I thank you for not asking me to stay." Below that, nothing. No signature, no initial. Not even the faded trace of one removed. And folded into the same envelope, wrapped like something fragile, was the key. The same small brass key, too. The locker at Gare de Lyon, which he had not expected to see again. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he slid the envelope and its contents into the top drawer of his desk and locked it. He didn't mention it. Not that day. Not ever. At lunch, he stepped out alone and walked the perimeter of the 12th arrondissement with no particular urgency. He passed the bakery where she had once bought an eclair. He paused outside the tobacconist where she had asked for envelopes without windows. He lingered near the alley where the shoes had first appeared, the canal steps glistening again in the morning light. Everything had resumed, as though nothing unusual had ever taken place. A woman in a blue raincoat passed with her child. Delivery man tilted his bicycle onto the curb. The city did what cities do. It absorbed the quiet exits without ceremony. That evening, Maigret returned home to the scent of roasting onions and thyme. Madame Maigret was preparing a stew. He hung his coat on the usual hook and removed his shoes, more slowly than usual. "You're early," she said gently, without turning from the stove. "Not early, just finished." She glanced at him briefly, then returned to stirring. He sat down at the table, rolled a cigarette, then let it rest in the ashtray unsmoked. His hands were large and still, the knuckles worn from years of desk edges and cold weather. He watched the smoke rise from the pot and thought of nothing, or perhaps everything. After dinner, he brought out the small typewriter he rarely used. An old model, not electric, heavy and stubborn with a sticking. He placed a fresh sheet in the carriage and sat for a while, hands idle above the keys. Then, without flourish or pressure, he typed 3 lines. She left no trace. That was the trace. And beneath that, some departures are not absences. They are choices. And choices, like lives, do not always need witnesses. He didn't type his name. He didn't file it. He folded the page, slid it into a manila envelope, and placed it in the back of the same drawer where the key now rested. Next to the farewell notes, the silent signature, and the fragments of a case that was never a case. The next morning, he rose early, drank his coffee while it was still hot, kissed Madame Maigret on the cheek, and walked again through the damp streets of Paris. A new file would arrive. Some burglary in Montparnasse, a missing wallet. A man who claimed to have lost his brother in a bar fight no one remembered. He would follow it, carefully, methodically. He would ask questions no one wanted to answer. He would wait in the corners of rooms until someone broke under their own truth. That was what he did. But for now he simply walked, slowly, without destination. The sky was heavy with spring rain, and the canal shimmered faintly under the morning. Clouds. He paused at the railing, leaned against the cold iron, and looked out across the water. The steps were clean. Nothing remained. Except, perhaps, a presence, or its deliberate absence. And Maigret, in that moment, understood something he would never say aloud. Some stories are not told in full. Some are simply witnessed, then folded. Away. 3 days had passed since the envelope with the key arrived. It had not been mentioned. Not by Maigret, not by Janvier, not by anyone at the Quai des Orfèvres. Even Madame Maigret, who had long mastered the art of reading silences, had not asked about the change in her husband's demeanor. She simply laid out his scarf in the morning with greater care and replaced his tobacco pouch with fresh-cut leaf without comment. To Maigret, it felt as though the case, if it could be called that, had folded back into the city itself, like fog retreating into the Seine after dawn. And yet, as with all things that disappear quietly, something of it lingered. Not a clue, not a question. Just an atmosphere, persistent as damp wool. That morning, Maigret found himself walking once again near the Canal Saint-Martin, not to investigate, not even to think. Just to walk. The cobblestones were slick with overnight drizzle, and the air was thick with the smell of iron and smoke. He passed the same bench near the water where old men played dominoes in better weather. Today, it was empty. He crossed over the lock. At Rue Diane paused on the footbridge, staring at the slow, eddying current. From here, the rooftops of the 10th arrondissement lined up like the backs of old books. Familiar, unchanging. He lit his pipe, though the tobacco was damp. He didn't really expect the match to hold. And it didn't. A voice behind him said, "You're not here for me again, are you?" He turned. It was Paul Besson. The man looked thinner, if that was possible. Paler, certainly. He wore a scarf that had seen better days and held his coat shut with one hand, though all its buttons were intact. His other hand clutched a folded newspaper, unopened. Maigret didn't speak at once. He simply stepped aside slightly so that Besson could join him at the railing. "I thought you might be gone," Maigret said finally. "I was. For a time. She's gone." Besson nodded. "I know. I received a note." Maigret glanced at him. "Posted from Paris?" "No, Charleroi. It was brief." "Just a line," she said. "Don't wait. There's nothing left to follow." Maigret puffed at his pipe, managing a thin trail of smoke at last. "You believe her?" "I believe she means it. Whether it stays true, I don't know." There was a silence then, not uncomfortable but laden. Besson said, "You followed her for longer than most would have." "I didn't follow," Maigret replied. "I listened." The two men watched the canal a moment longer, until a barge passed slowly beneath the bridge, its engine grumbling like a man too tired to shout. On its deck stood a solitary worker in a yellow slicker, drinking coffee from a metal mug. "You saw her before she left," Besson said. Maigret nodded. "What did she say?" "That she didn't want to be remembered." Besson gave a faint smile. "Then perhaps we've both failed her. Perhaps. But I think she knew we would." They stood like that for a long while. Then Maigret said, "Where are you staying now?" "Nearby. A room over a locksmith's shop on Rue des Vinaigriers. Cheap, but dry. And the owner doesn't ask questions." "Are you working?" "I translate instruction manuals for a small firm, water pumps, sometimes sewing machines. It's dull, but the words don't ask for anything but order." Maigret nodded. "Sometimes that's enough." A pigeon fluttered down near their feet, then darted away again as a cyclist passed. The city stirred in its usual way, steady, disinterested, indifferent. "Will you keep the letter?" Maigret asked. Besson tapped the folded newspaper. "It's inside. Don't lose it." "I won't." Maigret turned then, his pipe nearly extinguished. "She left something with me too." Besson looked at him. "A confession? A key?" Besson's eyes moved, unreadable. "To what?" Maigret gave a faint shrug. "To nothing now." They parted without ceremony, no handshakes, no promises. Maigret continued south along the canal while Besson disappeared behind the old bakery, the folds of his coat blending into the rain-worn walls of the alley. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret found a message from Janvier waiting on his desk. "Woman asking for you, no name given. Said she was looking for a boarding house once run by a Madame Juvin. Left no contact. Voice sounded northern, possibly Belgian." Maigret read it twice. Then he folded it, placed it in the drawer with the other letters, and made no remark. That afternoon, he walked to Rue Bichat, where he knew a Madame Juvin had once run a modest house for single women and clerks new to the city. The house was gone now, converted into apartments with high gates and buzzers. The new nameplate read Residence du Canal. No one named Juvin remained. He stood for a time before the gate, watching shadows move behind frosted windows. He did not ring. Instead, he crossed to the Tata across the street, ordered a coffee, and sat near the window. The woman had come too late. Or perhaps as always, just late enough. The city does not stop. People leave in pieces. They vanish not in the night, but in the middle of the day, from rented rooms, from bridges, from benches where they once read books with missing covers. And sometimes they reappear, not in person, but in notes left behind, in quiet requests, in folded keys placed without explanation into the palm of a man who asks no questions. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Maigret finished his coffee and stepped out into the cooling air. He turned his collar up against the wind and made his way back toward the quay, The case, if there ever had been one, was gone. But the memory of it was etched into the corners of the city now. A trace of shoes at the Canal, a silence on Rue Popincourt, and the knowledge, quiet and lasting, that sometimes the most profound mysteries are the ones that end not with discovery, but with acceptance. It was Sunday morning when Maigret returned to the Canal for the last time. The sun was out, not boldly, but in the muted, uncertain way of early spring, and the clouds above moved slowly, casting long shadows across the water. The air was damp but not unpleasant. Somewhere behind him, a church bell sounded the hour, though he didn't count the chimes. He hadn't meant to come back. He had meant to rest, to spend the day as Madame Maigret had hoped, in their small kitchen, reading the newspaper while she kneaded dough for a tart filled with pears and cinnamon. But the walk had pulled him, not out of obligation, not even curiosity, just the quiet thread of something unresolved that insisted, gently, on being followed to the end. The spot where the shoes had first appeared looked the same as it always had. A few pigeons strutted nearby. A young couple sat on the steps, sharing the sandwich. A fisherman unspooled his line with the indifference of someone who didn't expect to catch anything, but liked the waiting. Maigret stood, his coat unbuttoned, hat tilted slightly back. He didn't look for anything. He simply watched. This was where it had begun, not with a scream, not with a corpse, not with an emergency call, but with two shoes left deliberately side by side, as if their wearer had paused at the edge of the water, considered the depth, and stepped out of a life not with drama, but with decision, and now it had ended. If indeed it had. He walked slowly toward Rue du Faubourg du Temple, passing a flower seller arranging pale irises in buckets outside a shop. He paused. "They're for a funeral," the woman behind the cart said. "Or a beginning. Depends who you ask." Maigret smiled faintly and purchased a single stem. He didn't say why. At home, Madame Maigret greeted him with a raised eyebrow. "You've missed the tart," she said. "There'll be another," he replied, setting his hat on the peg. She glanced at the iris in his hand and said nothing more. Instead, she poured him a small cup of coffee and returned to her seat, where she was sewing a button onto one of his old jackets. Later that day, after a short nap and a second walk, this time together, arm in arm through the narrow streets behind Place des Vosges, Maigret sat at his desk and unlocked the drawer where he had placed the envelope, the letters, the key. He unfolded the note Lisa had sent, the last one, typed and unsigned, and read it again. "I'm going now. Not out of fear or sadness, simply because I have finished what I needed to finish." He held the key in his palm. It was warm now, having absorbed the heat of his hand, a small, ordinary thing. But to someone, once, it had been the final object left in the world worth handing over. Not money, not a keepsake. A key to a locker, to a room, to a part of herself she no longer wanted to carry. He placed it gently inside a small envelope and sealed it without writing anything on the front. Then he rose, put on his coat, and returned once more to the street. The walk took him past the railway station, where travelers moved in and out like currents. Laughter, bags wheeled across tile. A boy crying because he had dropped his toy. Life moving on. He dropped the envelope into a public letterbox outside the station. No address, no return. Let it go where it would. That night, he sat with Madame Maigret beside the radio, the broadcast of the distant concert playing softly in. The background violins too delicate for the static. They didn't speak. She knitted, and he smoked, and between them passed a kind of peace born not of resolution, but of stillness. The next day, a man came into the Quai d'Orfèvres to report a missing person. Maigret listened patiently as the man explained. A young woman, recently arrived from Liege, was supposed to have met him at a pension in Montmartre. She had written him 3 times. But now there was no word. She had vanished. Her name was not Lisa Moreau, but the shape of the story was familiar. After the man left, Maigret stood at the window of his office and watched the street below. It was raining again, the kind of rain that looked like it might stop any minute, but never did. People hurried under umbrellas. A delivery boy rode past, whistling. He turned back toward his desk and lit a new pipe. The tobacco burned clean. He let it rest in the ashtray, untouched. He thought of the first time he saw the shoes, pale beige, slightly angled inward, placed with impossible care. And he realized that he would remember them always, not because of what they signified, but because of how quietly they had spoken. The world leaves louder marks, usually. Crashes, screams, blood. But some absences speak in whispers. And sometimes, those are the ones that last longest. He didn't open a file for the new woman from Liege. Not yet. He waited. Outside, the rain continued, softly. Inside, Maigret sat still, listening. Not for answers, but for echoes.